Ethan Carter had not flown in nearly 4 years. He had not allowed himself to. Every spare dollar over the past 8 months had gone into a single envelope tucked inside the top drawer of his home desk, a plain white envelope with 2 words written on the front in blue ink. New York. Not a vacation. Not a reunion. A meeting that would determine whether the small logistics company he had been quietly rebuilding from nothing would survive another year, or fold quietly into the long list of things Ethan Carter had once built and lost. He wore his one good suit, a charcoal gray that was beginning to show its age at the elbows, pressed nonetheless with the kind of careful attention a man gives to something he can no longer replace. His shoes were polished. His boarding pass was folded neatly in his breast pocket. He had arrived at the terminal 2 hours early, carried only a single carry-on bag, and walked to his gate without rushing, because Ethan Carter had learned long ago that hurrying rarely changed anything that mattered. He had eaten breakfast at home that morning, toast and black coffee, the same breakfast he had been eating for 11 years, and had sat at his kitchen table for longer than necessary after he finished, not because he had anything left to do, but because the apartment was quiet in a way that asked to be honored. And he had learned, over the course of a life that had contained its share of departures, to honor quiet when it was available. He had purchased a first-class seat. That fact alone had cost him more than he was comfortable admitting. The envelope had taken 8 months to fill, and the ticket had emptied most of it in a single transaction that he stared at on his phone screen for nearly 5 minutes before confirming. But the meeting required him to arrive rested, clear-headed, and composed. He had learned what exhaustion did to a man in negotiations, how it softened the edges of his thinking, how it made a person agree to things they would never agree to on a full night's sleep. The first-class seat was not luxury. It was strategy. It was the last professional decision he could afford to make before walking into a room where everything would be decided. He settled into seat 2A by the window, placed his bag in the overhead compartment with practiced efficiency, and sat down. He did not open his laptop. He did not order anything. He simply folded his hands in his lap, closed his eyes for a moment, and breathed. Outside the small oval window, ground crews moved in the gray morning light, loading luggage into the belly of the aircraft, with the indifferent rhythm of people who did this 1,000 times without thinking. Ethan watched them for a while, and felt, for the first time in months, something close to calm. The man in the seat across the aisle glanced at him briefly. The way fellow first-class passengers do, assessing, filing, moving on, Ethan did not notice. He was already thinking about the meeting, about the numbers he needed to present, about the particular kind of confidence that was required not when things were going well, but when they were not, and you still needed the room to believe in you. What no one in that cabin knew, what no one outside of a single sealed boardroom envelope knew, was that Ethan Carter had once built this airline from nothing. Not as an investor, not as an executive brought in from outside. He had built it as a founder, in his late 20s, with a borrowed office, 2 employees, and a business plan written on yellow legal paper. He had named it himself, registered it himself, flown the first promotional route himself, in a leased prop plane, with a borrowed co-pilot and 12 passengers, who had no idea they were witnessing the very first flight of what would become one of the largest regional carriers on the East Coast. That had been 15 years ago. A lot had happened in 15 years. He had grown the airline, scaled it, weathered 2 recessions and 1 near bankruptcy, and then, in a quiet act that almost no one had ever fully understood, he had walked away. He had sold the majority of his stake to a private equity consortium, signed the transfer documents in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon, and driven home in the same 10-year-old car he still drove today. He had not issued a press release. He had not given interviews. He had simply left, the way a man leaves a room when he is certain the people inside no longer need him. But he had kept one thing, a single clause buried in the original founding documents, a clause so old and so rarely discussed that most of the current executive team didn't even know it existed, entitled him to what the original legal language called a golden founder share. It was not a financial instrument. It carried no dividends. It conferred exactly one power, absolute and irrevocable: the authority to convene the board, suspend operations, and make personnel decisions at any level of the organization, at any time, without prior notice. It was the kind of clause that made sense only in the context of a young founder who had been burned once before and had insisted, during the original incorporation, on a single failsafe that no future board could strip away. Ethan had never used it. In 15 years, he had never once touched it. He had almost forgotten he had it. Almost. The morning he had booked this flight, sitting at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold and his boarding confirmation on the screen in front of him, he had remembered the clause, the way you remember a spare key you've kept in a drawer for years, without needing it, not with urgency, not with intention, simply with the awareness that it was there. The gate door opened with the pneumatic hiss of pressurized air, and the last passengers began boarding in the quiet shuffle of rolling carry-ons and rustling jackets. Ethan was watching the tarmac when he heard the voice, not loud at first, but carrying the particular quality of a man accustomed to being heard without needing to raise his volume. It was a tone built from decades of rooms where everyone deferred and no one pushed back. Richard Dawson boarded the aircraft the way certain men enter spaces, with the assumption that the space was already his. He was wearing a suit that cost more than Ethan's monthly rent, a watch that gleamed even in the muted cabin light, and an expression of mild irritation that appeared to be his resting state. He paused at the threshold of the first-class cabin, looked down the row of seats, and let his gaze land on Ethan Carter. It stayed there for a moment longer than necessary. A faint smile crossed his face. Not the kind that invited anything, but the kind that categorized. Ethan recognized it instantly. He had seen it before, in conference rooms and airport lounges and elevator banks. The brief, dismissive appraisal of a man who sorted the world into people who mattered and people who were in the way. Richard Dawson stepped forward, stopped beside seat 2B, and without looking at the flight attendant standing nearby, said, with complete and quiet certainty, "That seat belongs to someone important." The words were not addressed to anyone in particular. They were released into the cabin the way a man tosses a coin into a fountain without expectation of return, simply as an expression of how he understood things to be arranged. The flight attendant, a young woman named Sophie, who had been with the airline for less than a year, looked from Richard to Ethan and back again with the visible discomfort of someone caught between two forces she did not yet know how to navigate. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked toward the front of the cabin where the purser was standing, and the purser looked toward the galley where the lead flight attendant, Allison Mercer, was finishing a pre-departure check. Allison had been with the airline for 11 years. She carried herself with the brisk authority of someone who had managed enough difficult passengers to believe she had seen everything. She stepped into the aisle, looked at Richard Dawson, at his suit, his watch, his absolute certainty, and then looked at Ethan Carter, in his aging charcoal suit, with his folded boarding pass and his quiet hands. Something in her made a calculation that took less than 3 seconds. It was not a vicious calculation. It was not even a conscious one. It was the kind of assumption that forms in the gap between what a person sees and what they choose to verify, shaped by years of small confirmations that the world tends to arrange itself in predictable hierarchies. The suit on the left spoke the language of money and urgency. The suit on the right was just a suit. Allison smiled at Richard Dawson with the practiced warmth of a senior crew member greeting a valued passenger. She turned to Ethan Carter, and in the polished, professional tone of someone who believed she was managing a situation rather than creating one, she said, "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to follow me." The cabin went quiet, in the way that spaces go quiet when something is happening that everyone can feel but no one wants to name. Several passengers near the front had turned in their seats. A man in a business suit 3 rows back had stopped typing on his laptop. An older woman by the window was watching with an expression of careful attention, the kind that belongs to people who have witnessed enough of the world to recognize a particular type of injustice before it has finished happening. Richard Dawson had settled into the aisle with his arms loosely crossed, the posture of a man watching something resolve itself in his favor. He said, loudly enough for the nearest 4 rows to hear, "He obviously can't afford this seat." The words landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height. They were not spoken with cruelty exactly, they were spoken with the casual authority of someone stating a fact about the weather, which made them, in some ways, worse. Cruelty acknowledges that something matters enough to hurt. Dismissal does not even extend that courtesy. Sophie, the young flight attendant who had hesitated at the door, took a half step forward and said, quietly but clearly, "Allison, shouldn't we check the boarding pass first?" Allison turned. Her look was brief and definitive, the kind of look that communicates, without words, that the question was inappropriate and the timing was worse. She said nothing to Sophie. She looked back at Ethan and gestured toward the economy cabin with a small, firm motion of her hand. "Sir, please." Ethan Carter stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He did not pull out his phone to film anything, or threaten anything, or demand to speak to anyone's supervisor. He stood up from seat 2A with the same unhurried composure with which he had sat down, retrieved his carry-on from the overhead compartment, and looked at Allison Mercer with an expression that was not angry, and not defeated, and not particularly readable. He had been in rooms, over the years, where people had said worse things, and looked at him in worse ways. And he had learned, not quickly, and not without cost, that the moment you let someone else's behavior determine your own, you have handed them something they do not deserve. He asked one question. He asked it quietly, in the tone of a man who wanted the answer on the record even if no one was keeping a record. "Are you refusing to verify my ticket?" Allison held his gaze for a moment. She did not answer. The cabin was perfectly still. 14 passengers were watching. 3 crew members were present. No one said a word. Ethan nodded once, the small, deliberate nod of a man who has just received the only answer he needed, and walked toward the back of the aircraft without another word. Richard Dawson watched him go with the satisfied expression of a man who had just confirmed something he already believed about the world. Allison straightened her jacket and returned to her pre-departure checklist. Sophie stood in the aisle for a moment after Ethan passed, watching the empty first-class doorway, feeling the particular discomfort of having witnessed something she couldn't quite name and hadn't been able to stop. She would think about that moment later on the jetway, in the terminal, at home that evening, and she would understand, with increasing clarity, that the discomfort was not confusion. It was the sensation of having been right and been silenced, which is a different thing entirely. In seat 34C, Ethan Carter placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, settled into the narrow seat, and reached into his jacket pocket. He did not open the boarding pass. He did not look toward the front of the plane. He took out his phone, unlocked it, and navigated to a contact he had not used in over 3 years. The contact was listed under a single designation, not a name, not a title, just 2 initials and a department. COC, Chief Operations Center. The number connected to a dedicated line that ran, at all hours, to the senior duty manager on shift at the airline's regional operations hub. It was a number that Ethan had set up himself, in the first year of the airline's operation, as a founder's direct channel to the heartbeat of the system he was building. He had never expected to use it for something like this. He had imagined it for emergencies, weather diversions, mechanical failures, the kind of operational crises that required a founder's authority and a fast decision. He typed a single word into the message field. He looked at it for a moment. The way a man looks at a tool he has never had occasion to use and is now certain he needs. He pressed send. The word was, proceed. He put his phone back in his pocket and looked out the window at the gray morning light on the tarmac. Around him, the economy cabin was filling with the sounds of settling passengers, the click of seatbelts, the murmur of conversations, the distant thud of the cargo hold closing, the aircraft door sealed with a pressurized lock. The jetway retracted. Richard Dawson, settled into seat 2A with his jacket hanging open and his phone in his hand, exhaled with the long satisfaction of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted. Allison Mercer completed her pre-departure briefing with her crew and walked to her jump seat near the front galley. She was thinking about her layover schedule in New York. She was thinking about dinner. She was not thinking about Ethan Carter. The phone in the cockpit rang 4 minutes and 53 seconds after the aircraft door sealed. Captain James Hartwell had been running through his pre-flight checklist with the methodical focus of a man who had completed this sequence roughly 8,000 times and still treated it as if it mattered every time, because in his view, it did. He picked up the handset on the second ring, identified himself, and listened. His first officer, seated beside him and half watching the instrument panel, noticed the change in the captain's posture before he noticed the change in his expression. The shoulders came back slightly. The jaw set. Something behind the eyes shifted from the practiced calm of a man doing a routine task to the particular alertness of a man who has just been told something that requires his complete attention. Captain Hartwell said 3 words into the handset. "I understand." Confirmed. He set the handset back in its cradle and sat still for exactly 4 seconds, long enough for his first officer to notice and say nothing, understanding by instinct that this was one of those moments that required observation rather than comment. Then he unclipped his harness, stood up, and opened the cockpit door. He walked into the first-class cabin with the deliberate pace of a man who was moving quickly without appearing to hurry, which is a skill that takes years to develop and is recognizable to anyone who has spent time around people in positions of real authority. He stopped in the aisle of the first-class cabin and looked at the crew gathered near the galley partition. His voice was level and clear and carried no particular emotion, which somehow made it more commanding than if it had. Which crew member removed a passenger from seat 2A? The question landed in the cabin like a dropped instrument. Allison Mercer looked up from the small fold-out she was organizing. She registered the captain's expression. She did not fully understand what she was reading in it, but something in her chest tightened. The other crew members in the galley had gone still. No one spoke. Allison stepped forward with the directness of a senior professional who had been asked a question and would answer it. She said, clearly and without apology, "I did, Captain. There was a dispute over the seat assignment." Captain Hartwell looked at her without expression. Then he said, in the same level tone, "Bring me his boarding pass." Now, Allison's certainty did not waver, not yet. She had managed seat disputes before. She had dealt with confused passengers, double-booked seats, system errors, and the occasional irate traveler who believed his printed boarding pass superseded the manifest. She had always been right. She was prepared to be right again. She retrieved the boarding pass that she had never examined during the incident, the one Ethan had held in his hand when she escorted him from the cabin, and handed it to Captain Hartwell. He took it without looking at it. Instead, he walked to the boarding panel at the forward door, where the scan terminal was still active from boarding, and ran the pass under the reader himself. The terminal beeped once. Then the screen, which normally returned a simple green confirmation, returned something different. It returned a red border. Inside the border, in the clean, sans serif font of airline systems that nobody ever expected to mean anything dramatic, were 4 lines of text. Passenger. Ethan Carter. Status. Confidential. Authorization. Board. Level clearance. Escort protocol. Active. Captain Hartwell read the screen. He read it again. He set the boarding pass down on the panel, with the careful precision of a man handling something he had not expected to be holding. He looked at Allison Mercer. He looked at the screen. He looked toward the closed economy cabin curtain at the back of the aircraft, beyond which sat a man in an old charcoal suit who had asked one quiet question and walked away without an argument. The captain said, "Open the aircraft door." The ground crew received the signal at 6:47 in the morning. The jetway extended back to the aircraft, with the hydraulic groan of equipment being operated on an unusual timeline, not the scheduled rhythm of departure, but the urgent, irregular motion of an unplanned return. Inside the terminal, 3 black SUVs had pulled to the curb of the tarmac access road in a formation that the ground operations supervisor later described as the kind of arrival you don't ask questions about. The vehicles had come from the airline's regional headquarters, which was located less than 12 minutes from the airport. The people who stepped out of those vehicles had received a single notification on their phones at 6:43 in the morning, 4 minutes after Ethan Carter had pressed send on a one-word message from seat 34C. The notification had come from a legal instrument that most of them knew existed in theory, and none of them had ever seen activated. It read, Golden Founder Share Invoked. Report to Gate 17. Immediate. It was signed with the initials E.C. Marcus Webb, the current chief executive officer of the airline, was in his car on the way to the office when the notification arrived. He read it twice. He told his driver to go to the airport. He did not explain why. Marcus Webb was the first one through the aircraft door. He was followed by the legal director, a woman named Patricia Holt, who carried a tablet and wore the expression of someone who had spent the car ride reviewing documents she never expected to need. Behind her came the head of human resources, a man named Daniel Sorrell, who had been in the middle of breakfast when his phone had buzzed and had not finished it. And behind him, moving with the quiet gravity of a person who understood exactly what this moment meant, came the board secretary, Eleanor Marsh, who had been the one, 15 years ago, to draft the original clause that had made all of this possible. She had typed those words, Golden Founder Share, irrevocable, perpetual, binding upon all successors on a standard legal template in a borrowed conference room, while a 29-year-old man with yellow legal paper and a borrowed co-pilot looked over her shoulder and made small, careful corrections to the language. She had not seen Ethan Carter in over a decade. She recognized him immediately when she reached row 34. They walked through the first-class cabin in a single file, past the rows of passengers who had fallen into a silence so complete that the hum of the auxiliary power unit outside was audible. Richard Dawson, in seat 2A, watched them come with the dawning, unpleasant awareness of a man who has just noticed that the people entering the room are not looking at him. They were not looking at anyone in first class. They walked past the galley partition, past the confused cluster of crew near the jump seats, and they kept walking through the curtain that separated first class from economy, until they reached row 34. Marcus Webb stopped at seat 34C. He looked at the man sitting in the window seat, the man in the aging charcoal suit with the folded boarding pass and the quiet hands, and he lowered his head. Not a nod. A bow, small, but unmistakable. Mr. Carter, he said. We are terribly sorry. The first-class cabin heard it, in the particular silence that the aircraft had maintained since the captain opened the door. The words carried clearly through the curtain and down the aisle, with the effortless precision of things said in quiet rooms. Richard Dawson heard it. Allison Mercer heard it. Sophie, the young flight attendant who had tried to ask about the boarding pass and been silenced, heard it from her position near the forward galley, and felt something in her chest release that she had not realized she had been holding. Several passengers who had watched the earlier scene from their seats heard it, and exchanged looks that contained no words and needed none. One man near the window took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes as if recalibrating. The older woman who had been watching carefully since the beginning had gone very still, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for something, and is now watching it happen, and does not want to move in case she disturbs it. Ethan Carter looked up at Marcus Webb and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Let's talk." He stood. He picked up his carry-on from the bin above seat 34C. He followed the group of executives back through the curtain and into the first-class cabin, where he stood in the aisle, and for the first time since boarding looked directly at Richard Dawson. Richard was still in seat 2A. He was no longer crossing his arms. His watch still gleamed, but the man wearing it had the look of someone who had walked into a room expecting to win an argument and had discovered that the argument was not the kind he had prepared for. Patricia Holt opened her tablet. She pulled up the original Articles of Incorporation, the 15-year-old document filed in the state of Delaware on a Tuesday morning by a 29-year-old man who had written a business plan on yellow, legal paper. She found the clause. She read it aloud, in the level, unhurried cadence of a legal professional who understood that the weight of a document is carried by its precision, not its volume. The Golden Founder Share, the clause that had never been invoked, the clause that gave its holder the authority to convene the board, suspend operations, and make personnel decisions at any level of the organization, at any time, without prior notice, in perpetuity, irrevocable, no transferable, and binding upon all successors and assignees. She looked up from the tablet. The cabin was absolutely quiet. Richard Dawson's expression had passed through several stages in the past 2 minutes. Confidence, then confusion, then something that might have been called recalibration, and was settling now into a kind that was harder to describe. The expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life in rooms where his certainty was a competitive advantage and is now sitting in a room where it has become a liability. He had not spoken since the executives boarded. The silence did not suit him. But he was wearing it because there was nothing else available. Daniel Sorrell had already pulled up the security camera footage on his own device, not the footage from outside the aircraft, but the footage from the cabin cameras mounted at the front of first class, which ran continuously from the moment the boarding door opened until the moment the aircraft was cleared at the gate on the other end. He connected the device to a small portable display that Eleanor Marsh had carried aboard and set it on the fold-out tray of the nearest unoccupied seat. The footage was clear. The camera angle was high and slightly forward-facing, the way cabin cameras are always mounted, and it captured everything that had happened in the first-class aisle from the moment Richard Dawson had boarded. It showed Allison Mercer approaching Ethan's row without a boarding pass reader. It showed her asking him to leave without requesting any documentation. It showed the moment Sophie had started to speak and had been silenced by a look, that brief, definitive look that carried its meaning clearly, even on a digital recording at a slightly elevated angle. It showed Richard Dawson in the aisle, and it captured the audio of his voice saying, clearly and without ambiguity, that Ethan obviously could not afford the seat. It showed Ethan standing, retrieving his bag, asking his single quiet question, receiving no answer, and walking away with the unhurried composure of a man who had already decided exactly what he was going to do next. Every frame was time-stamped. Every word was audible. Daniel Sorrell did not narrate the footage. He simply let it run. The only sounds in the cabin were the ambient hum of the aircraft systems and the faint, digitized voices of people who had believed, 40 minutes ago, that they were watching something that would have no consequences. When the footage ended, Patricia Holt looked at Allison Mercer. Allison was standing near the galley partition with the particular stillness of someone who has realized, in real time, that the facts of a situation are not what they believe them to be, and is still calculating what that means. Her 11 years of service felt, in this moment, less like a foundation, and more like a distance she had traveled in the wrong direction. All that accumulated experience, all those managed disputes and navigated complexities, and somewhere along the way she had stopped checking and started assuming, and the assumption had brought her here, to a sealed aircraft in the early morning with a camera recording she could not dispute, and a founder's legal authority she had not known existed. The 2 crew members who had been present during the incident were standing near the opposite wall. Sophie was still at the forward galley. She had not moved, but her posture had changed from the cautious uncertainty of before into something quieter and more resolved. The posture of a person who had done the right thing in the only way available to her at the time, and was waiting for that to be recognized. Richard Dawson had started speaking shortly after the footage began. He had offered an explanation, then a clarification, then something that was almost an accusation directed at the airline system for not making seat authorization levels sufficiently visible to boarding passengers. Patricia Holt had listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him the way a person looks at an argument they have already evaluated and set aside. She said nothing. She turned back to Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb looked at Ethan Carter and said, simply, "What would you like to happen?" It was the right question. It was perhaps the only question. Ethan took a moment before he answered, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to be certain that what he said was what he actually meant, and not the version of it that belonged to the anger he was not allowing himself to feel. He said, "I would like to know that the next person who sits in that seat, whoever they are, whatever they're wearing, whatever their account balance looks like, gets the same treatment I should have gotten today." Marcus Webb nodded. He looked at Daniel Sorrell. Daniel Sorrell looked at his tablet. What happened next took approximately 20 minutes, though it felt shorter and longer than that simultaneously, the way significant things often do when the mind is tracking several levels of reality at once and cannot commit fully to any single one of them. Marcus Webb read the decisions aloud, one at a time, in the tone of a man who had accepted that he was doing the right thing even though it was not a comfortable thing. Allison Mercer, terminated, effective immediately, for failure to verify passenger documentation, discriminatory treatment of a ticketed passenger, and obstruction of a crew member's attempt to follow protocol. Gregory the purser, dismissed for complicity and failure to intervene. Devon the flight attendant, dismissed for complicity. A formal review would determine the exact severance and record-keeping structure. Sophie, who had tried to check the boarding pass and had been silenced, would receive a commendation in her file and would be offered the position of lead attendant on the next available assignment. Richard Dawson, added to the airline's permanent no-fly registry, effective immediately, to be reported to the industry-wide monitoring system as required by charter. His name, his account, and all associated bookings would be flagged at every terminal the airline operated. The older woman near the window spoke then not loudly, but in the clear, carrying voice of a person who was accustomed to being heard when she chose to speak. She said, "Justice finally showed up." 2 or 3 people near her began to applaud. Then more. Then most of the cabin, in the uneven, organic way that applause spreads when it is genuine rather than performed, starting with a few people who felt it most immediately, and building into something that filled the whole aircraft with the particular sound of a group of strangers who had been through something together and found, at the end of it, that the ending was the right one. Ethan Carter stood in the aisle of the first-class cabin and listened to it. He did not smile with the satisfaction of a man who had won something. He did not look at Richard Dawson. He did not make a speech. He stood quietly and let it happen around him, the way a man stands in the rain when he has stopped trying to avoid getting wet, and simply holds still because there is nothing left to resist. Marcus Webb had one more thing to say. He waited for the applause to settle, and when the cabin had returned to its particular quality of attentive quiet, he turned to Ethan with an expression that was not quite formal and not quite personal, but existed somewhere in the careful middle ground of a man who was trying to say something true without performing it. "The company still needs its founder," he said. "Whatever form that takes advisory capacity, board representation, operational involvement, we would be honored to have you back." Ethan looked at him for a moment. He appreciated the offer. He could see that it was genuine. He could also see, and had seen it immediately, in the boardrooms he'd left 15 years ago, and in the quiet of the intervening years, that what the airline needed was not a founder. What it needed was a standard. He said, "I don't want the title. I want the policy." Marcus Webb said, "Tell me what you're thinking." And Ethan did. He called it the Passenger Dignity Policy. He laid out the framework in less than 10 minutes, in the unhurried, precise language of a man who had been thinking about systems for a long time, and had learned that the systems that worked were always the simple ones. The first principle: no passenger may be removed from or denied a confirmed seat without documented verification of the relevant boarding credential, recorded in real time, with the verifying crew member's identification logged to the flight record. Not a suggested protocol, a mandatory one, with no exceptions for status, urgency, or crew discretion. The second principle: any passenger complaint involving seat assignment, access denial, or differential treatment must be video documented from the moment the complaint is raised, using the existing cabin camera system already installed on every aircraft in the fleet. The footage must be reviewed by the relevant supervisor within 24 hours of landing, with a written response issued to the passenger within 48. The third principle: every customer-facing employee, from ticketing agents to cabin crew to gate personnel, must complete a bias recognition training module, updated annually, before being cleared for passenger-facing duties. Not a suggestion offered during onboarding. A certification, renewed every 12 months, with no exemptions for seniority or tenure. Patricia Holt had been typing while Ethan spoke, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had transcribed important things in important rooms for many years, and understood that the speed of capture was a form of respect for the thing being said. Eleanor Marsh had been recording. Marcus Webb had been listening with the focused attention of a man who had spent a decade running an airline and was hearing, perhaps for the first time, the kind of clarity about what an airline was, for that he had been circling without landing on. When Ethan finished, Marcus looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the board document on her tablet. She said, "We have a quorum present for preliminary ratification." She said it calmly, the way an accountant reports a balance. Marcus Webb said, "Then let's ratify it." He looked at Ethan. "Is that acceptable?" Ethan said, "That's sufficient." He meant it. Richard Dawson was escorted from the aircraft by 2 members of ground security who had arrived on the jetway during the final stage of the proceedings. He did not make a scene, not because he lacked the impulse, but because he had spent enough time in professional environments to understand when a situation had moved entirely beyond the reach of anything he could say. He walked down the jetway in his expensive suit, past the ground crew who stepped aside without looking at him, and into the terminal, where he would need to rebook a flight on a different airline for a different time, and explain to whoever was waiting for him at the other end why he was late. He did not look back at the aircraft. There was nothing back there for him to look at that he wanted to see. The gate door closed behind him with the same pneumatic hiss with which it had opened 2 hours earlier, and the cabin, first class and economy both, in the unified way of spaces where something shared has just occurred, exhaled. Captain Hartwell returned to the cockpit. The ground crew completed their second departure check. The jetway retracted. Sophie walked through the first-class cabin with a tray of water and small glasses, which she offered quietly and without ceremony to each passenger as she passed, and several people thanked her with the particular warmth reserved for someone who had tried to do the right thing in a moment when it had cost her something. She smiled at each of them with the careful, grounded dignity of a person who had not yet fully processed what the past 2 hours meant for her career, and who was choosing, in the absence of that processing, to simply do her job. That choice, small, unglamorous, made in the middle of an extraordinary morning without any audience for it except the passengers who happened to be watching, was, in its own way, exactly the thing that Ethan Carter had been talking about, the thing the policy was trying to protect, the instinct to verify, to pause, to ask the question that no one else was asking, even when the room made that feel like the wrong move. Sophie did not know, passing through the cabin with her tray, that she had already passed the only test that mattered. Ethan Carter returned to seat 2A. Not triumphantly, not with ceremony. He simply walked back to the front of the aircraft, placed his carry-on in the overhead bin for the second time that morning, and sat down in the window seat he had paid for with 8 months of carefully accumulated savings. He buckled his seatbelt. He looked out the window. The gray morning had not changed. The tarmac was still gray. The sky was still the flat, indifferent white of early morning cloud cover, and the ground crews were still moving in their steady rhythm below. But something felt different. Not resolved exactly. Resolution, Ethan had learned, was rarely as clean as people imagined it would be. The morning's events would ripple in directions he couldn't fully anticipate. There would be news coverage, eventually. There would be conversations in boardrooms and training sessions, and perhaps in the homes of people who had been on this flight. There would be a formal policy filed in a legal document and ratified at a board meeting on a Monday morning by people who would vote for it and move on to the next item on the agenda without fully understanding what had made it necessary. But in this moment, in seat 2A, on a morning that had begun with one man being told he didn't belong there, something felt simply and cleanly like alignment, like a thing that had been slightly off-center had been returned to the place it belonged, without fanfare, simply because someone had taken the time to put it there. Marcus Webb settled into the seat beside him. He did not open his laptop. He did not take out his phone. He sat the way men sit when they have something to say and are deciding how to say it. After a moment, he said, "Today, you didn't just save a passenger." He paused. "You saved the soul of this airline." Ethan did not respond immediately. He was still looking out the window, where the last of the ground crew had finished their work and were pulling the chocks from beneath the main gear. The engines were beginning their slow, rising sequence, the deep, preliminary turbine note that always preceded the more authoritative roar of takeoff power. He had heard that sound thousands of times, in hundreds of aircraft, on the early routes, when he had sometimes sat in the jump seat behind the first officer, just to feel what it was like to be part of something that actually flew. He had never gotten tired of it. He turned from the window and looked at Marcus Webb, with the expression of a man who was about to say something simple that he had spent a long time knowing. "I didn't build this airline to be powerful," he said. "I built it to take people where they needed to go." He paused for exactly a beat. "That hasn't changed." Marcus Webb held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Not the formal, executive nod of a man in a meeting, but the quieter nod of one person acknowledging another across the distance of everything they have not said and do not need to say. The engines continued their rise. The aircraft began to move. The plane lifted from the runway at 7:23 in the morning. 11 degrees into a clouded sky that broke, briefly, into pale winter light as they climbed through the lower cloud layer and emerged above it into the wide, clean blue that exists above weather. The kind of blue that looks the same from every aircraft, on every route, at every altitude. Regardless of what happened on the ground, before the wheels left the pavement, the kind of blue that does not reward or punish. It simply exists, indifferent and magnificent, available equally to everyone who rises far enough to reach it. Ethan Carter watched it through the oval window and felt the particular lightness that comes not from triumph, but from completion, from having done, in the quiet and unremarkable way that most important things are done, exactly what needed to be done, and no more. He had not raised his voice. He had not threatened anyone. He had not given a speech or demanded recognition or waited for an apology that would undo what had already happened. He had sent a single word to the right people and trusted that the systems he had built, long ago, in a borrowed office with 2 employees and a business plan on yellow legal paper, were still sound enough to do what systems are built to do, to hold a standard in place when the people around it are not holding it themselves. Below the aircraft, the city was receding. The terminals, the access roads, the gate where a man in an expensive suit was standing with his luggage and no ticket home. Above, the sky was expanding into the particular vastness of a clear morning above the clouds, and ahead, still hours away but already real, was New York City and a meeting and the next chapter of something Ethan Carter had been building, quietly and without announcement, for a very long time. He closed his eyes. He breathed. He did not think about what had happened in the cabin that morning. He thought about the meeting. He thought about what he would say when he walked into the room. He thought about the people who were depending on him, the small team, the logistics company, the next version of something built carefully from almost nothing. He thought, as he sometimes did in quiet moments, about the first flight of the airline he had founded, the 12 passengers who hadn't known they were witnessing a beginning, the borrowed co-pilot, the legal paper, the envelope of money that had taken years to fill the first time and months the second. He thought about how most things worth building look, from the outside, like nothing at all, like a man in an old suit on a routine flight, folding his hands in his lap and looking out the window at the ordinary world below. He thought about how rarely the world could tell the difference between a man who had built something extraordinary and a man who simply appeared to belong somewhere. He thought about Sophie, passing through the cabin with her tray, doing her job in the middle of an extraordinary morning. He thought about the clause he had written at 29, not out of arrogance, but out of the hard-learned knowledge that the things you build can be taken from you, but the standards you set into the foundation are harder to remove. He thought about Eleanor Marsh, typing those words in a borrowed conference room while he read over her shoulder. And he thought about how neither of them had imagined, on that Tuesday afternoon 15 years ago, that those words would ever be needed. And he was glad, with a quiet and uncomplicated gladness, that they had been written anyway. Outside, the blue was everywhere above and ahead, and in every direction that the eye could travel from that small oval window. It was the same blue it always was. It belonged to no one. It was available to everyone, and for now, for the length of this flight, and whatever came after it, it was more than enough. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room or a cabin, or a courtroom, or any enclosed space where a significant thing has just been decided that is different from ordinary silence. Ordinary silence is the absence of sound. This other kind is the presence of something that has not yet been named, the hum of a fact that everyone has registered but no one has yet converted into words or action. The first-class cabin of that aircraft held that kind of quiet for several minutes after Richard Dawson walked down the jetway and the door was sealed again. Passengers who had planned to work on laptops found themselves sitting with their screens closed. A young man in the row behind where Ethan now sat leaned his head against the window and looked out at the gray tarmac with an expression that was not quite contemplative and not quite sad. It was the expression of someone reconfiguring. The older woman who had said what she said about justice had gone back to her book. But she was not reading it. She was holding it open at the same page she had been on when Richard Dawson had boarded, and her eyes were resting on the words without taking them in, because her mind was somewhere else entirely. Sophie had refilled a passenger's water glass 3 times out of habit before the passenger gently touched her arm and said, with a kind smile, "I think I have enough." Sophie had laughed a small, surprised laugh, and the laugh had moved through the nearby rows like something that had been needed. And several people near the front smiled without quite knowing why. This is what justice looks like in the small hours of an ordinary morning. Not the thunderclap of a verdict, not the dramatic reversal of a courtroom scene, but the quiet continuation of things after something that was wrong has been set right. The aircraft still had to fly to New York. The engines still had to spool through their sequence. The passengers still had to stow their bags and set their seats upright and turn off the devices they had been told 3 times to turn off. The world did not pause to mark what had happened. It simply continued, as it always does, around the correction, incorporating it the way a river incorporates a stone, not by stopping, but by moving around it, over it, finding the new shape of the channel, and settling into it, as if that shape had always been the natural one. Ethan Carter knew this. He had known it for a long time. He had built things and lost things, and walked away from things and returned to things, and through all of it the world had continued its indifferent motion, pausing for none of it. What you had, in the end, was what you had done. And whether what you had done was what you had meant to do. He had meant to take a flight to New York. He had meant to arrive, composed and prepared, and ready for the most important meeting of his recent life. He was going to do exactly that. Everything else had simply happened in between, the way things happen in between when you are the kind of person you are, and the world is the kind of world it is, and occasionally, not often, but occasionally those 2 facts arrive at the same moment and produce something that neither of them could have produced alone.